The sun was just breaking over the horizon when the screams started echoing across Riverside Plantation. 5 voices crying out in agony as flames consumed their flesh in a coordinated inferno that would shake the entire South to its core. These weren't the screams of innocent victims. These were the death cries of 5 overseers who had spent years perfecting the art of human torture. And the man who lit those fires had been perfecting his revenge even longer. His name was Elijah, and what he did at dawn that morning wasn't just murder. It was divine justice delivered with the precision of a master craftsman and the fury of a man who had finally decided that some sins can only be cleansed with fire. What drives a human being to orchestrate the simultaneous burning alive of 5 men? What kind of systematic cruelty creates a monster so methodical that he could watch 5 people burn to death and feel nothing but satisfaction? This is the story of Elijah of Virginia, the slave who turned the plantation's own tools of torture against those who wielded them. A revenge so perfectly executed that it terrified every overseer in the South. A morning of fire so precisely planned that it took investigators months to understand how one man had orchestrated 5 simultaneous executions without a single witness surviving to tell the tale. What he did to those overseers will make you question everything you think you know about justice and revenge. And what happened when the plantation owners finally caught him will prove that some forms of resistance are so terrifying that they change the very nature of oppression itself. So ask yourself this: if you had the power to make your tormentors burn alive, would you light the match? Because Elijah's answer illuminated the Virginia dawn with the flames of reckoning. Spring 1856, Riverside Plantation, Henrico County, Virginia. Elijah was 34 years old and had been the property of Master Cornelius Whitmore for 22 years. But ownership was a strange word for what had developed between a man whose spirit refused to break and the 5 overseers who had made breaking him their personal mission. The plantation covered 400 acres of prime tobacco land and operated what appeared to be one of the most profitable farming operations in the state. Its success wasn't built on efficient agriculture. It was built on a system of control so brutal that neighboring plantation owners whispered about it in horrified fascination. The 5 overseers were the key to everything. Marcus Bellwether, 41, was the head overseer, a massive man whose specialty was psychological torture disguised as discipline. Samuel Hartwell, 38, had perfected the art of prolonged whipping, able to keep a victim conscious and screaming for hours without causing death. Thomas Blackwood, 35, was known throughout Virginia for his creative punishments, designing tortures that other overseers studied and imitated. William Crawford, 32, specialized in breaking the spirits of strong slaves, using a combination of isolation, starvation, and calculated humiliation. Jonathan Pierce, 29, was the youngest but perhaps the most sadistic, a man who had discovered that the threat of violence could be more effective than violence itself when applied with sufficient imagination. Elijah had experienced all of their specialties. Over the years, he had been whipped by Hartwell until his back looked like raw meat. He had endured Blackwood's creative tortures, including being buried alive for 3 days with only a breathing tube and being suspended over a fire until his feet blistered. He had survived Crawford's psychological warfare, spending months in solitary confinement with barely enough food to keep him alive. He had lived under Pierce's constant threats, never knowing when a casual conversation might trigger hours of brutal punishment. But here's what made Elijah different from the hundreds of other slaves who had been broken by this system. He was learning. Every punishment became a lesson in their methods. Every torture session taught him something new about their psychology. Every moment of agony was filed away in a mind that was planning something far more sophisticated than simple revenge. The plantation's official records showed 247 slaves, but the real number fluctuated constantly as slaves died from overwork, punishment, or simple despair, and new ones were purchased to replace them. The mortality rate at Riverside was nearly double that of neighboring plantations, but Master Whitmore considered it an acceptable cost of maintaining absolute discipline. What made Riverside's operation unique wasn't just the scale of the brutality. It was the methodology. While other plantations relied on fear and occasional punishment to maintain control, Riverside had created a systematic program of psychological and physical torture designed to break slaves so completely that resistance became literally unthinkable. The 5 overseers operated with the efficiency of a well-coordinated military unit. They had divided the slave population into categories based on perceived threat levels, with different punishment protocols for each group. They maintained detailed records of every slave's psychological profile, documenting weaknesses that could be exploited and strengths that needed to be eliminated. Elijah was classified as a Category 5 slave, the highest threat level, reserved for those who showed signs of intelligence, leadership ability, or resistance to authority. Category 5 slaves received special attention from all 5 overseers, who rotated responsibility for their supervision to ensure that no slave could predict or adapt to a single overseer's methods. But the psychological manipulation required to maintain this system was as sophisticated as it was cruel. The overseers had convinced themselves that they were performing a necessary service, civilizing savage Africans through firm discipline and consistent punishment. They framed their brutality as educational, their torture as character building, their sadism as duty to their race and their God. For the slaves, the overseers used a combination of rewards and punishments that kept them compliant while destroying their sense of self-worth. Slaves who informed on others received better food and lighter work assignments. Those who showed perfect obedience were occasionally allowed small privileges that could be revoked at any moment. Anyone who showed signs of resistance faced punishments so severe that other slaves would do anything to avoid similar treatment. The most insidious aspect of the system was how it turned slaves against each other. The constant threat of punishment created an atmosphere where everyone was a potential informant, where friendships were dangerous, where trust could be fatal. The overseers had created a world where the only safe emotional state was complete numbness. But Elijah had discovered something that the overseers never suspected. Their system contained the seeds of its own destruction. By rotating among all 5 overseers, he had learned each of their routines, their schedules, their personal habits, their fears. By maintaining perfect obedience for years, he had become nearly invisible to them, just another broken slave who no longer required constant supervision. Most importantly, he had learned that their confidence in their system had made them careless. They assumed that 22 years of systematic brutality had destroyed any capacity for resistance. They believed that their psychological torture had eliminated any possibility of organized rebellion. They were convinced that slaves like Elijah were incapable of the kind of long-term planning that effective revenge required. They were catastrophically wrong. The plan that Elijah developed over the course of 3 years was so sophisticated, so perfectly orchestrated, that it required not just intelligence, but the kind of strategic thinking usually associated with military commanders. He had to account for timing, weather, guard rotations, sleeping patterns, building layouts, and dozens of other variables that could determine the difference between success and failure. The first challenge was acquiring the necessary materials without arousing suspicion. Fire required fuel, and fuel required access to resources that slaves weren't supposed to have. Elijah solved this problem by volunteering for extra work assignments that gave him legitimate reasons to be in areas where he could gather what he needed. Over the course of months, he accumulated lamp oil, dry kindling, rope, and various chemical compounds that he had learned could accelerate combustion. He hid these materials in locations throughout the plantation, creating multiple supply caches that could support his plan, even if some were discovered. The second challenge was timing. The 5 overseers lived in separate cabins, scattered across the plantation, making simultaneous attacks seemingly impossible for a single person. But Elijah had noticed that their schedules followed predictable patterns, and on Saturday nights, they all followed routines that would make them vulnerable at approximately the same time. Bellwether always drank himself unconscious by 11 p.m., passing out in his chair by the fireplace. Hartwell would be asleep by midnight after his weekly visit to a slave woman he kept for his personal use. Blackwood worked late in his cabin every Saturday, reviewing punishment schedules and slave reports. Crawford suffered from insomnia and took laudanum every Saturday night to sleep. Pierce was usually passed out drunk by 10 p.m. after spending his evening gambling with other overseers. The third challenge was creating simultaneous fires that would burn fast enough to prevent escape, but slow enough to ensure maximum suffering. This required careful preparation of each cabin, positioning combustibles, and creating ignition systems that could be activated quickly and quietly. Elijah's solution was brilliant in its simplicity. He would spend the hours before dawn moving between the cabins, setting up his fires so that they would all ignite within minutes of each other. The timing had to be perfect, too early, and some overseers might be awake and able to escape. Too late and the dawn light would make him visible to any guards or early rising slaves. On the night of May 15, 1856, Elijah put his plan into motion. At 4:30 a.m., he began his circuit of death, moving like a ghost through the Virginia darkness. He had planned every step, every movement, every action for this moment. This wasn't just revenge. It was the culmination of years of careful study, patient planning, and absolute commitment to justice. The first target was Pierce, whose cabin was farthest from the slave quarters and least likely to wake anyone. When the screaming started, Elijah crept to the cabin where Pierce lay in drunken stupor, poured oil around the foundation and walls, then used a slow, burning fuse to delay ignition until after he had moved to his next target. Bellwether was next, unconscious in his chair exactly as Elijah had predicted. The cabin was prepared, the combustibles positioned, the ignition system activated. By the time the flames reached Bellwether, Elijah was already moving toward his third target. Crawford's cabin required more delicate timing because the laudanum made his sleep lighter than natural unconsciousness. But Elijah had accounted for this, using a faster, burning accelerant that would create an inferno before Crawford could fully wake up. Blackwood was still awake in his cabin, working by lamplight on his punishment reports. This was the most dangerous part of the plan, requiring Elijah to set fires around an alert target without being detected. But years of moving invisibly through the plantation had taught him skills that made this possible. Hartwell was the final target. Sleeping heavily in his cabin, after his weekly assault on a slave woman, who would never have to endure his attention again, Elijah took extra time with this cabin, ensuring that the fire would burn slowly enough to wake Hartwell before killing him, giving him time to understand what was happening and why. By 5:15 a.m., all 5 fires had been set. Elijah returned to the slave quarters, slipped into his cabin, and waited for the screaming to begin. The first scream started at 5:23 a.m., when Pierce woke up surrounded by flames. His cabin was already fully engulfed, the fire so intense that escape was impossible. His cries were high-pitched, terrified, the sound of a man who had spent years inflicting agony finally experiencing it himself. Bellwether's screams joined Pierce's at 5:25 a.m., deeper and more confused as the alcohol in his system made him slow to understand what was happening. By the time he was fully awake, the fire was already consuming his clothing and flesh. Crawford's cries began at 5:27 a.m., sharp and panicked as the laudanum-induced fog cleared, and he realized he was trapped in an inferno. His screams had a particular quality of disbelief, as if he couldn't comprehend that someone had done this to him. Blackwood's voice joined the chorus at 5:29 a.m., initially angry, rather than frightened, as he tried to command the fire to obey. His was the way everything else on the plantation had always obeyed. His screams grew more desperate as he realized that his authority meant nothing to the flames. Hartwell's screams started last at 5:31 a.m., and they were the most satisfying to Elijah's ears because he could hear recognition in them. Hartwell understood exactly what was happening and why, and his final moments were filled not just with physical agony, but with the psychological torture of knowing that his victim had outsmarted him completely. The 5 fires burned like beacons against the dawn sky, visible for miles across the Virginia countryside. The screaming lasted for nearly 20 minutes, a symphony of agony that announced to everyone within hearing distance that the natural order of Riverside Plantation had been permanently shattered. Master Whitmore arrived at the scene just as the screaming was beginning to fade, and what he found challenged every assumption he had ever made about his slaves' capacity for organized resistance. 5 cabins burning simultaneously wasn't an accident or a coincidence. It was a coordinated attack that required intelligence, planning, and strategic thinking that he had convinced himself was impossible for slaves to possess. The investigation that followed revealed the sophistication of Elijah's planning and the complete failure of the plantation's security systems. The fires had been set with professional precision, timed to maximize both physical damage and psychological impact. The evidence suggested that the perpetrator had intimate knowledge of each overseer's personal habits and had planned the attack for months or even years. Here's what made this attack so terrifying to plantation owners throughout Virginia. There were no witnesses, no evidence that directly implicated any specific slave, no way to prove who had orchestrated the fires. Elijah had planned not just the murders, but the perfect crime, leaving investigators with the knowledge that someone on the plantation was capable of systematic, premeditated execution, but no way to identify or punish the perpetrator. The reaction from other plantation owners was immediate and panicked. If one slave could kill 5 overseers simultaneously without being detected, what did that mean for the security of every plantation in the South? How many other slaves were capable of similar planning and execution? How could they protect their overseers from attacks they couldn't predict or prevent? The psychological impact on overseers throughout the region was even more profound. Men who had built their careers on inspiring fear in others suddenly found themselves afraid. The knowledge that their victims might be planning revenge created a paranoia that made effective slave management nearly impossible. Most importantly, the attack had demonstrated that the most brutal forms of oppression could create the most sophisticated forms of resistance. By subjecting Elijah to years of systematic torture, the overseers had inadvertently created a monster far more dangerous than any ordinary rebel. They had taught him patience, planning, and precision skills that he had then used to orchestrate their destruction. The manhunt for the perpetrator lasted for months, but despite offering enormous rewards and threatening severe punishments for anyone who withheld information, authorities never identified Elijah as the killer. His years of perfect obedience had made him invisible to suspicion, and his careful planning had eliminated any evidence that could connect him to the crime. But the most significant impact of the attack was how it changed the psychology of slavery throughout Virginia. The knowledge that slaves were capable of such sophisticated, revenge-made plantation owners questioned every aspect of their relationships with their human property. Trust became impossible, paranoia became constant, and the system that had depended on assumed superiority and natural dominance suddenly seemed fragile and temporary. Elijah lived for another 6 years after his dawn of fire, maintaining his mask of perfect obedience while secretly savoring the knowledge that he had achieved something unprecedented in the history of American slavery. He had killed 5 white men simultaneously and escaped all consequences, proving that even the most powerless people could find ways to claim ultimate justice when they combined intelligence with patience. He died in 1862, just months before the Emancipation Proclamation would have given him legal freedom. But in his final moments, surrounded by fellow slaves who had never learned his secret, Elijah could take satisfaction in knowing that he had already achieved the only freedom that mattered to him, the freedom that comes from watching your enemies burn alive in fires of your own creation. The story of the Riverside Dawn fires became legend throughout the slave community in Virginia, passed down through generations as proof that no oppression was so complete that it couldn't be overcome by sufficient determination and intelligence. Though most people never learned Elijah's identity, his example inspired countless other acts of resistance and revenge. The 5 overseers were buried in unmarked graves, their families too ashamed of their deaths to create permanent memorials. The methods they had perfected for breaking human spirits died with them, and their reputation for invincibility was replaced by a legacy of fear that made other overseers throughout the South more cautious in their brutality. Master Whitmore never replaced the 5 overseers, instead selling Riverside Plantation and moving his family to Richmond, where he spent his remaining years as a broken man haunted by the knowledge that one of his slaves had orchestrated the perfect crime. He died in 1864, still wondering which slave had possessed the intelligence and determination to kill 5 men without leaving a trace. The plantation itself was eventually abandoned, the buildings left to decay, as no one wanted to live in a place where screams of burning overseers had once echoed across the dawn sky. Local folklore claimed that the sound of screaming could still be heard on quiet mornings, carried on the wind from the ruins of 5 cabins, where justice had finally been served. Today, the site of Riverside Plantation is marked only by overgrown foundations and a historical marker that makes no mention of the dawn fires or the slave who orchestrated them. The official history of Henrico County treats the incident as an unsolved mystery, 5 unfortunate deaths that remain unexplained. In the oral traditions of African American families throughout Virginia and beyond, the story of Elijah's revenge lives on as a reminder that no system of oppression is so perfect that it cannot be overcome by sufficient intelligence, patience, and determination. The slave who chose fire as his weapon proved that even the most powerless people can find ways to claim justice when they are willing to plan carefully and strike decisively. The dawn that illuminated 5 burning cabins in 1856 also illuminated a truth that plantation owners spent years trying to suppress: that their absolute power was an illusion, their security was false, and their victims were far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. Elijah's fires didn't just kill 5 overseers. They burned away the myth of invincibility that the entire system depended on, replacing it with a fear that would haunt slaveholders until the system itself finally collapsed. The man who turned dawn into Judgment Day proved that some forms of justice cannot be delayed indefinitely, and that the most methodical minds often belong to those who have suffered the most systematic cruelty. His legacy burns eternal in the knowledge that oppressors create their own destruction when they push their victims beyond the breaking point, and that fire, once lit, consumes everything it touches without regard for the social order that kindled it.